A Mustang stood trapped at the edge of a deadly cliff, every second more precarious than the last. The ground beneath its trembling hooves crumbled away, leaving it one misstep from disaster. A man armed with nothing but a rope and unyielding determination risked everything to save a creature that didn't trust him. What unfolded after their lives collided would challenge everything you know about courage, survival, and the unspoken bond between man and animal. The late afternoon sun dipped low over Montana's rugged Bitterroot Range, casting long shadows across the landscape. Ethan Cross, a seasoned guide with over a decade of navigating treacherous trails, was accustomed to nature's beauty and brutality. But today, as he carefully descended a narrow path etched into the cliffside, his stomach clenched at the sight ahead. Ethan dropped to his knees, anchoring himself with the rope. "Hey, hey!" he said quickly, his voice firm but soothing. "Look at me. Don't look down. Just keep your eyes on me." The Mustang hesitated, its nostrils flaring as it let out a sharp, terrified snort. Ethan's heart pounded as he held his ground, keeping the rope steady. Slowly, the horse's eyes shifted back to him. Its breathing was ragged, its chest heaving, but it didn't rear. Instead, it took a cautious step forward, the rope pulling taut in Ethan's hands. "That's it," Ethan said, relief flooding his voice. "You're doing great." They moved in fits and starts, the Mustang pausing every few steps to catch its breath. Ethan's own legs felt like lead, his hands raw from gripping the rope, but he refused to stop. Each step brought them closer to the top, closer to safety. As they neared the final stretch, a sudden gust of wind whipped through the canyon, kicking up dust and debris. The Mustang spooked, its hooves slipping dangerously close to the edge. Ethan lunged forward, grabbing the rope with both hands and digging his heels into the ground. "Hold on," he shouted, his voice raw with desperation. The horse stumbled but managed to regain its footing, its wide eyes locking onto Ethan as if seeking reassurance. Ethan didn't let go. He pulled with everything he had, his muscles screaming in protest as he guided the Mustang back onto the path. The moment felt like an eternity, but finally, they reached the top of the cliff. Ethan collapsed to his knees, his chest heaving as he struggled to catch his breath. The Mustang stood a few feet away, its legs trembling but stable. For a moment, neither of them moved. The only sounds were the wind howling through the canyon and the distant calls of birds. "You did it," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. He looked up at the Mustang, his green eyes meeting its dark, intelligent gaze. "We did it." The Mustang didn't bolt. Instead, it stood there, its ears swiveling as it took in its surroundings. Ethan could see the exhaustion in its posture, the way its body sagged with relief. But there was something else, too, a quiet acknowledgement, a fragile bond forged in the crucible of survival. Ethan reached for his backpack, pulling out a small water bottle. He poured some into his hand and offered it to the Mustang. The horse hesitated, its nostrils flaring as it sniffed the water, but then it lowered its head, lapping at the liquid with cautious movements. "There you go," Ethan said softly, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You're going to be okay." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the canyon in deep orange and purple hues, Ethan knew their journey was far from over. The Mustang was injured and the nearest town was miles away. But for the first time, he felt a spark of hope. Together, they had conquered the cliff. Together, they could face whatever came next. The night air was cool and sharp, carrying the faint scent of pine and earth as Ethan led the Mustang away from the cliff's edge. The adrenaline of their escape had begun to fade, replaced by the biting reality of their situation. The horse's injuries needed attention, and they were still far from help. The Mustang limped beside him, its steps uneven and labored. Ethan's heart ached at the sight of fresh blood trickling down its hind leg, dark against its chestnut coat. The horse had fought so hard to survive, yet it remained vulnerable, teetering on the edge of collapse. Ethan glanced up at the night sky, where the stars stretched endlessly, their light faint but constant. He pulled a flashlight from his pack, the beam slicing through the darkness. Ahead, he spotted a dense thicket that opened into a small clearing. It wasn't much, but it would have to do for the night. "Come on, buddy," Ethan said softly, tugging gently on the rope. Just a little further. The Mustang hesitated, its ears swiveling nervously, but it followed him into the clearing. The Mustang's ears flicked back, but it followed, and Ethan couldn't help but marvel at the animal's resilience. It had every reason to resist, to give up, but it hadn't. Somehow, it had chosen to trust him, a stranger, and that trust weighed heavily on Ethan's shoulders. When they reached the clearing, Ethan dropped his pack and began setting up a small camp. He laid a blanket on the soft grass, coaxing the Mustang to lie down. The horse resisted at first, its muscles tensing as Ethan approached, but his calm voice and gentle touch eventually won it over. "Easy now," Ethan murmured, crouching beside the animal. He reached for his first aid kit, his fingers brushing against the worn fabric of his pack. "Let's take a look at that leg." The Mustang's dark eyes watched him warily as he began cleaning the wound. Ethan worked with practiced precision, his hands steady despite the exhaustion pressing down on him. The injury was deep, with jagged cuts along the leg caused by brambles, but there was no sign of a break. Relief washed over him, though he knew the journey ahead would still be difficult. "You're tough," Ethan said with a faint smile. "I'll give you that." The Mustang huffed softly, its nostrils flaring. Ethan took it as a good sign. At least the horse still had some fight left in it. He finished cleaning the wound and carefully wrapped it with a bandage from his kit. As he worked, he spoke to the horse in low tones, his voice a steady presence in the quiet night. "You know," he said, leaning back on his heels, "I wasn't always good at this. Used to think I could do everything on my own, but life has a way of humbling you, doesn't it?" The Mustang didn't respond, of course, but Ethan felt a strange comfort in talking to the animal. Its presence, its quiet strength, made him feel less alone. He hadn't realized how much he needed that. As the hours passed, the clearing grew colder, the night wrapping around them like a heavy blanket. Ethan built a small fire, the flickering flames casting long shadows across the trees. He sat beside the Mustang, watching as the horse rested its head on the ground, its body finally relaxing. Ethan's mind wandered to the past, to the choices that had led him here. He thought of the mistakes he'd made, the people he'd let down, and the quiet guilt that followed him wherever he went. But tonight, as he sat beside this wild, injured creature, he felt something shift. Redemption wasn't something you found all at once. It was earned moment by moment, choice by choice. The Mustang stirred, its ears flicking as the fire crackled. Ethan reached out a hand, brushing it gently against the horse's neck. This time, the horse didn't flinch. Instead, it let out a low, contented sigh. "Maybe we'll both figure this out," Ethan said softly, his voice barely audible over the wind. Together, the stars above shone brighter now, their light cutting through the darkness. The clearing was still, the world holding its breath as man and horse found a fragile peace. Ethan leaned back against his pack, his eyes heavy with sleep, but his heart lighter than it had been in years. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with dangers and unknowns. But for now, they had each other, and that was enough. The morning sun rose slowly over the clearing, bathing the grass and trees in a soft golden light. Ethan stirred from his makeshift bed, his back aching from the uneven ground. He glanced over at the Mustang, which was still lying down, its head resting on the earth. The horse's chestnut coat shimmered faintly in the sunlight, but its breathing was labored, and Ethan could see the tension in its muscles. "Morning, buddy," Ethan said softly, sitting up and stretching. His voice broke the silence of the dawn, and the Mustang's ears twitched in response. It lifted its head slightly, blinking at him with dark, intelligent eyes. Ethan smiled. At least the horse was still alert. He rummaged through his pack, pulling out a small canteen of water. Pouring some into a shallow dish, he placed it in front of the Mustang. The horse hesitated, sniffing the water cautiously before taking a few tentative sips. "That's it," Ethan encouraged. "You've got to stay strong. We've got a long way to go." He checked the bandage on the horse's leg, wincing at the sight of fresh blood seeping through. The wound was worse than he'd hoped, and without proper care, infection was a real possibility. Ethan knew they needed to reach the nearest town as soon as possible, but the journey would be grueling for both of them. As he packed up the camp, the Mustang struggled to its feet, its movements slow and deliberate. Ethan watched carefully, ready to intervene if the horse faltered, but the Mustang managed to stand, its legs trembling but steady. "You're tougher than you look," Ethan said, patting the horse gently on the neck. "Let's get moving." The two set off, the forest coming alive around them with the sounds of birdsong and rustling leaves. The path ahead was uneven, winding through dense trees and rocky terrain. Ethan kept a steady hand on the rope, guiding the Mustang with patience and care. At first, the horse followed reluctantly, its steps hesitant, but as the hours passed, it began to move with more confidence. The sky, which had been clear in the morning, started to change. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, their edges tinged with an ominous gray. Ethan frowned, glancing up at the shifting weather. "Storm's coming," he muttered to himself. The air felt heavier, the kind of weight that precedes a downpour. Ethan quickened his pace, urging the Mustang to keep up. They needed to find shelter before the rain hit. The first drops fell as they reached a narrow ridge, the wind picking up and whipping through the trees. Ethan's grip on the rope tightened as the Mustang's steps grew more uncertain. The horse's ears flicked back, and it let out a nervous snort. "It's okay," Ethan said, his voice calm despite the tension building in his chest. "We're almost there." The rain came suddenly, a torrential downpour that drenched them in seconds. The path turned slick with mud, each step a struggle to maintain balance. Ethan's boots slipped on the wet ground, and the Mustang stumbled behind him, its hooves skidding dangerously close to the edge of the ridge. "Easy, easy," Ethan shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of the rain and wind. He pulled on the rope, steadying the horse as it regained its footing. The panic in its eyes mirrored his own, but he couldn't let fear take over. Through the haze of rain, Ethan spotted an overhang of rock jutting out from the ridge. It wasn't much, but it would provide some shelter from the storm. He led the Mustang toward it, every step a battle against the elements. By the time they reached the overhang, both man and horse were soaked to the bone. Ethan tied the rope securely to a nearby tree, ensuring the Mustang wouldn't slip or wander. Ethan tied the rope securely to a nearby tree, ensuring the Mustang wouldn't wander off in the chaos. He crouched beside the horse, his body trembling from the cold. "You're okay," he said, his voice hoarse. Placing a hand on the Mustang's neck, he felt the animal's warmth against his palm. "We're okay." The storm raged on, the wind howling and rain pounding against the earth. Ethan leaned back against the rock, his mind racing. The journey ahead felt impossible, but giving up wasn't an option. The Mustang needed him, and somehow that gave him the strength to keep going. As the hours passed, the storm began to subside, the rain easing into a gentle drizzle. The Mustang shifted beside him, its body relaxing as the tension ebbed away. Ethan took a deep breath, a glimmer of hope piercing through the exhaustion. The road ahead would be long, but they had survived the storm together. Whatever came next, they would face it side by side. The morning after the storm felt like a gift from nature. The sky was a vibrant blue, clear of the heavy clouds that had loomed the day before. The forest sparkled with raindrops clinging to leaves, and the air smelled fresh and clean. Ethan stretched, wincing as his muscles protested from the previous day's exertion. He turned to the Mustang, now grazing on a patch of wet grass a few feet away. The horse looked better, though its movements were still cautious. The makeshift bandage on its leg had held through the storm, but Ethan knew the injury needed proper attention soon to avoid infection. "Good morning, buddy," Ethan said, walking over to the horse. Kneeling, He carefully unwrapped the damp bandage. The gash was red and swollen, but it wasn't as bad as he'd feared. "You're one tough little guy, aren't you?" he said, smiling faintly. The Mustang snorted softly, as if in agreement. Ethan chuckled, pulling out a fresh roll of gauze from his pack. As he worked, he spoke to the horse in soothing tones. "I've seen a lot of wild things in my life, but you've got a spirit like no other. I think we're going to make it." Once the wound was rewrapped, Ethan stood, brushing the dirt off his knees. He scanned the path ahead. The storm had left the trail muddy and slick, but he could see the edge of the forest thinning in the distance. Beyond it lay open fields, and if his memory served him right, there was a small ranch about 10 miles away. It wasn't much, but it was their best chance for help. "All right," Ethan said, tightening the straps on his pack. "Let's see what we can do." The Mustang followed willingly, its steps more confident than the day before. They moved at a slow but steady pace, the sun warming their backs as they left the shadows of the forest behind. Ethan marveled at the horse's resilience. Just days ago, it had been on the brink of death, yet here it was, pushing forward with determination. That determination mirrored his own. When they reached the edge of the woods, the landscape opened up before them. Rolling fields stretched as far as the eye could see, dotted with wildflowers and clusters of trees. In the distance, the faint outline of a barn stood out, its red roof stark against the greenery. "There it is," Ethan said, pointing. "That's where we're headed." The Mustang's ears perked up, its eyes following Ethan's gesture. The sight of the open field seemed to energize the horse, which picked up its pace, tugging gently on the rope. Ethan smiled, feeling a renewed sense of hope. The journey across the fields was easier than the treacherous forest, but no less exhausting. The sun climbed higher, its heat beating down on them as they trudged forward. Ethan shared his water with the Mustang, rationing what little he had left. Every step felt like a small victory, a triumph over the odds stacked against them. As they neared the ranch, a figure appeared in the distance. A man stood near the barn, shading his eyes as he watched them approach. Ethan raised a hand, his arm heavy with fatigue. The man waved back, then started toward them, his pace quickening. "You need help?" the man called, his voice carrying across the field. Ethan nodded, his throat too dry to respond. When they met, the man's eyes widened at the sight of the injured Mustang. "Good Lord," he said, his voice filled with concern. "What happened?" "It's a long story," Ethan replied, his voice hoarse. "Can you help him?" The man, who introduced himself as Hank, didn't hesitate. He led them to the barn and helped Ethan tend to the Mustang's wounds with proper supplies. Hank's knowledge of horses was evident in the way he worked, his hands steady and sure. "You've got a fighter here," Hank said, patting the Mustang's neck. "He's lucky you found him." Ethan glanced at the horse, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I think we're both lucky." As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the ranch, Ethan sat outside the barn, watching the Mustang graze in the paddock. Despite its injuries, the horse moved with a quiet grace, its spirit unbroken. Ethan felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. For the first time, he believed they were going to be okay. The following morning, Ethan leaned against the paddock fence, watching the Mustang in the soft morning light. The horse's movements were still tentative, its injured leg wrapped securely in fresh bandages, but there was a quiet strength in the way it carried itself now. "You've come a long way, haven't you?" Ethan said aloud, though he knew the Mustang couldn't answer. Still, it felt right to voice his thoughts. "Tougher than anyone gave you credit for, including me." Hank approached from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. "He's looking better," he said, nodding toward the Mustang. "You did good, Ethan. Not many folks would have gone through all that to save a wild horse." Ethan shrugged, his gaze never leaving the Mustang. "I don't know if it's what I—" "Does he have a name?" Hank asked, breaking the silence. Ethan hesitated, then shook his head. "I hadn't thought about it." "Well, you should," Hank said with a grin. "A horse like that deserves a name." Ethan considered the suggestion, his mind drifting back to the canyon, the storm, and every moment they had fought to survive together. "How about Spirit?" he said finally. "Seems fitting." Hank nodded. "Spirit it is." The next few days passed in a blur of routine and care. Ethan spent hours tending to Spirit, cleaning his wounds, and ensuring he had enough food and water. With each passing day, the Mustang grew stronger. His movements became more confident, and his coat regained its healthy shine. Before long, Spirit was trotting around the paddock, his injured leg barely slowing him down. But as Spirit healed, Ethan found himself grappling with a difficult decision. The ranch was a temporary haven, a place where Spirit could recover, but it wasn't his home. The Mustang belonged in the wild, where he could run free, untethered by fences and ropes. The thought of letting Spirit go weighed heavily on Ethan's heart. He had grown attached to the horse in a way he hadn't anticipated. Spirit wasn't just an animal. He was a reminder of resilience, of the will to keep moving forward even when the odds seemed insurmountable. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Ethan stood in the paddock with Spirit. The Mustang nuzzled his shoulder, a gesture that felt almost like a thank you. Ethan ran a hand along Spirit's neck, his voice low and steady. "You've got your strength back," he said. "You don't need me anymore." Spirit snorted softly, as if in protest. Ethan chuckled, though the sound was tinged with sadness. "I'm serious. You're meant to be out there, running wild, not stuck in a place like this." Hank appeared at the gate, his expression somber. "You've decided, then?" he asked. Ethan nodded, though the decision felt like a weight pressing down on his chest. "Yeah, it's time." Hank clapped a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "You're doing the right thing. It's hard, but it's what's best for him." Together, they opened the paddock gate. Ethan led Spirit to the edge of the field, where the open plain stretched endlessly before them. The Mustang hesitated, his ears flicking back as he looked at Ethan one last time. For a moment, Ethan thought Spirit might stay, that the bond between them was too strong to break. But then, with a flick of his tail, Spirit bolted, galloping across the field. His chestnut coat gleamed in the fading sunlight. Ethan watched him go, a mix of pride and heartache swelling in his chest. "He'll be okay," Hank said quietly. "And so will you." Ethan nodded, his eyes never leaving the horizon. "Yeah," he said softly. "We both will." The fields were quiet the next morning. The early light spread gently over the rolling hills as Ethan sat on the fence near the paddock, sipping from a mug of coffee Hank had handed him before heading into the barn. His eyes scanned the horizon, searching for a familiar silhouette that he knew wouldn't be there anymore. Spirit was gone, galloping back to the life he was born to live. The thought filled Ethan with conflicting emotions. Pride and sadness intertwined in a way that left a hollow ache in his chest. He had done the right thing, but that didn't make it any easier. The Mustang's departure had left a void in Ethan's routine, the hours he had spent caring for Spirit, talking to him. Ensuring Spirit's survival had become more than just a mission. It had been a lifeline for Ethan, too. It was as if the horse's struggle mirrored his own. Now that Spirit was gone, Ethan felt adrift. Hank's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "You're quiet this morning," the older man said, leaning against the fence beside him. "Missing him already?" Ethan nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah, it feels strange not having him here. I keep expecting to see him standing by the fence, waiting for me." Hank chuckled. "That horse was special, no doubt about it. But you gave him a chance, Ethan. You gave him freedom. That's more than most people would have done." Ethan took a sip of his coffee, the warmth grounding him. "I just hope he's okay out there. He's a Mustang," Hank said with a shrug. "Born to survive. Born to roam. He'll be just fine." Ethan nodded, but his thoughts drifted back to the moment Spirit had bolted across the field. The way the horse's muscles rippled with strength, the sunlight catching on his chestnut coat. It was a sight Ethan would never forget, etched into his memory like a photograph. Spirit had looked back at him once, just for a moment, before disappearing into the wild. The day stretched on, quiet and uneventful. Ethan busied himself helping Hank with chores around the ranch, trying to fill the hours and distract his mind. But as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a warm golden glow over the landscape, he found himself wandering back to the edge of the field. He stood there for a long time, his hands resting on the wooden gate, watching the horizon. The vastness of the plains seemed to stretch forever. The tall grass swayed gently in the breeze. Ethan took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill his lungs. It was peaceful here, but it wasn't where he belonged. At least not anymore. Hank joined him, leaning on the gate beside him. "You thinking about moving on?" he asked, his tone understanding. Ethan hesitated before nodding. "Yeah." Spirit reminded me of something I'd forgotten, that it's okay to keep going, even when it's hard. Staying here has been good, but it's time for me to figure out what's next. Hank clapped him on the back. "Well, whatever it is, you'll do just fine. And hey, don't be a stranger. You're always welcome here." "Thanks, Hank," Ethan said quietly, his voice sincere. "For everything." As the last light of day faded into twilight, Ethan felt a sense of closure he hadn't expected. His journey with Spirit had changed him in ways he was only beginning to understand. The Mustang's fight for survival had reignited something in him, a spark, a purpose, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there is still hope. Ethan turned from the gate, his steps slow but steady, walking back toward the ranch. He didn't know where the road would lead him next, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face it. And as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, he made a silent promise to himself to live with the same courage and freedom that Spirit had shown him, because life, like the wild, was meant to be lived fully. If the story touched your heart, remember that acts of kindness, no matter how small, can change lives, both human and animal. Just like Ethan and Spirit's journey, we all have the power to create hope and freedom. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share it with someone who loves inspiring tales. Let's keep spreading stories of courage, resilience, and unbreakable bonds that connect us all. Thank you for watching.